Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the June Node meeting. I hope that you enjoy the song as you logged in. My name is Olivia Ortega, and I'm the Director of Advocacy at the Greater Cleveland Partnership. I recently also joined the program committee for Node, so I'm very happy to be here and to introduce today's speaker. Like I said, I hope you enjoyed that song. It was picked by our guest today, and it was getting us ready for the fourth and appropriately named Canadian-American singer, Neil Young, as we look to have a conversation about recent trade developments and supply chain disruptions, and also Ohio's strong relationship with Canada to support natural resources and other items required for areas of industry like electronic vehicles and other issue areas like input tax credits. So if you have any questions during the presentation, please put them in the chat and we'll answer as many as possible. At this time, I would like to introduce our guest presenter, Dan Ujczo, who will give us some insights on this topic. Dan is the Senior Counsel of International Trade and Transportation for Thompson, Hine, and he is also Honorary Consul of the Government of Canada to Ohio. He focuses on providing end-to-end counsel across clients, Canada, US, North America, and global supply chain needs. And he is very qualified to give us his insights today because of this work. So we look forward to hearing from you, Dan. I will hand it over to you. The virtual podium is yours.
Great, good morning, and thank you, Olivia, and the entire team at GCP and Team NEO and the entire Node family. I'm sitting from Washington, D.C. right now. I'm down here for Select USA, where many of our friends and colleagues are. Ohio's getting a lot of love down here with some major announcements yesterday, but when I'm sitting at our DC office in our soundproof room, I didn't realize it would have kind of this Dr. Evil feel to it. So sorry for I'll quickly share screen, but it's great to be with everybody. As many of you know, I see a lot of folks and a lot of familiar names and even friends on the list here. I'm a Northeastern Ohio guy. I grew up, I'm one of 42 grandchildren on my mom's side that all live from Parma and that all live within about 10 minutes of each other in southwestern Cuyahoga County, and then my dad's an East Sider. So my mom's a West Sider, my dad's an East Sider, so an unholy alliance there. But I actually grew up in the Mahoning Valley. I'm from Warren, Ohio, born in Parma, raised in Warren, Youngstown, and so I'm kind of a Team NEO guy, and then a Buckeye, and I live in Columbus now. I've worked in the U.S. government, Canadian government, and then came back to the dark side of private law practice, and just a few years ago came back to Thompson Hine, which is of course one of the original Northeastern Ohio law firms. And so it's a privilege to be here with everybody. Now, picking the song, I'll quickly share my screen here just so we can get off of this image of me here. So can you all see the screen here? Olivia, can you shake your head yes or no if you can see it?
Yes, we're good.
Okay, good. And then I'll start the slideshow. So the reason, I got really excited about this this song part of launching today's discussion because, I'm kind of into music. I'm not one of those guys that finds like obscure bands or anything, but, I thought, okay, there's a Canada-US theme that we're doing here today. Our great friends at the Canadian Consulate in Detroit, in partnership with GCP and Team NEO, brought this program together. And I thought, okay, so we'll have a Canadian theme. So obviously Drake, but none of the Drake songs I like we can actually play in a public setting like this. Then The Weeknd, which of course, but we all got burned out on the Super Bowl. And then of course there's the classics, right? There's Celine Dion, Shania Twain, Near, Far, Wherever You Are. And I just kept going through the list of our great friend at the Canadian Consulate, Christine Connell, who many of you know is an officer at the consulate, but is an Ohio person, used to be at Bowling Green running the Canadian Studies program there in Temacog. I know Christine's with us this morning. So we've our Ohioans have infiltrated the Canada-US space. But Christine was really pushing Rush. But again, all of my cousins went to St. Ed's and Holy Name. And if they didn't play sports, they were all drummers in the band and they all played Rush. So I'm burnt out on it. And so I just kept going down the list. And I ended up with either Alanis Morissette, but then that one has some questionable like things that we can maybe not want to talk about in the theater for a public setting. But I thought about it because Alanis Morissette, I saw her at the Buzzard Fest like in 1990 or something. I think I got arrested at Blossom because everybody did in those years. And then Bare Naked Ladies, If I Had $1 Million. And I thought if I had $1 million, I'd invest in Ohio, but that's too small for us these days. You know, we're all about the $1 billion investments, or if not more, in our great state, particularly following what our friends at Intel and others are doing. And then I landed on Neil Young, and I happened to be in the car one day, and I said, that's it. And part of it is, as was said at the beginning, is the idea that the 4th of July weekend and Canada Day are coming up, two very important holidays for our two countries. But it's also, as we talk today, thematic in terms of the starting point for today's discussion. And I want to talk a bit about how we got to the place where we are today. And I'll start at that period right before the fall of the wall. My intention is not to make this a history lesson, but my goal is to really start to say a lot of the things that happened when some of us were pretty young folks in the 90s and others are shaping the world in which we live today. Quickly get to that second area, which what's happening? This is going to be an extraordinarily active fall. Q3 and Q4 of this year are going to be transformative in many ways. So how does that impact what you're doing in terms of pitching companies and clients? You know, again, I'm here at Select USA. I got a ton of my clients here that have been meeting not only with Ohio, with every state, and everybody's got their pitch, right? My clients always ask me, Dan, is every state 500 miles from the best market in the world? And that's kind of how, you know, when you hear the pitches all day long. But what are some of the things that we believe are happening that are really going to impact Ohio as part of your pitch? And then lastly, what are some things coming down the pike? And one of the key takeaways will be the times in which we live. One of our competitive advantages in the state of Ohio is the fact that we have our largest trading partner, Canada, up north. And I don't think we always pitched that, right? Now, Team Neo, I think it was, probably, I was going to say 10 years, it may be longer now, had that logo a while ago that had the map of Ohio, and then it had the concentric circles around. And then at some point, I think it was Jay and the gang said, let's put Canada on top, because Canada's part of that 500-mile or one-day truck drive radius. And as we'll see with a lot of what's going on in terms of companies that are investing, and I represent a number of those companies in the EV space, in the advanced manufacturing space, in food manufacturing, in water technology, solar technology. These companies that are making these decisions are looking for those connections. And so as we move forward, so those will be the issues for today. Now, how did we get here? You know, I'm a child born in the 70s. I used to say I'm in my mid-40s. My 11-year-old reminded me I'm not in my mid-40s anymore, which was kind of heartbreaking. But and then he didn't get any money in his Fortnite account after that comment. But the fact is that, you know, one of the best movies of our childhood was Rocky IV. And when you think about the time period before, when I was talking about the wall, is when going into the 90s, again, not to make this a history lesson, is we were dealing with major security issues, basically keep the nukes away from the Soviet Union and the Russians and everybody else that had them. And then that security framework, after 40, 50 years of the Cold War, depending on how you count, was the primary issue, was we would never be in that situation again. The other piece was technology. Everything that we use today was in many cases launched and developed. I remember setting up our first email account in the early 90s when I was at Ohio State. And it was so brand new, and we all have the jokes now, and we see them on Facebook about log on and AOL, but technology was moving at a pace unprecedented in really human history and continues to this day. And then most directly relevant to our discussion today is the trade discussion. And we had the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement in the late 1980s. That immediately followed the NAFTA. We had the Dominican Republic, CAFTA. And then at that point, because of the politics in the US said, we don't have time to go country by country and do trade deals. The politics are too tricky. It takes too much time. We as the United States are going to give up some of our leverage that we would have dealing with countries one-on-one or in multilateral ways. And we're going to put all our eggs in the basket of the World Trade Organization. And what happened, and those of us from Northeastern Ohio, this is this is something that, when I spend a lot of time here in DC at the think tanks and others, that we have to remind people that are just so pro trade, and I'm a trade lawyer, so I'm a believer in trade, but it didn't work out the way people thought it was. By the end of the 1990s, we started to see security wasn't quite working the way we thought. There were new threats. Technology, it wasn't just Y2K, but what does this all mean when we're carrying basically everything we own on this device in our pockets? And then, of course, on the trade side, and again, coming from the Mahoning Valley, I don't need to get into too much on trade. Didn't work out for everybody at that point. And at the very time that we were dealing with these issues, we had September 11th. So really at that point, and we forget that, how fast things moved in the 1990s on trade, on supply chains and everything else. And then at the very moment that we were really poised to do something about it and start making those adjustments, right? And this isn't a criticism of the folks. I mean, I was involved in some of that as a young lawyer and as a researcher. I've spent time in Russia and helping Russia get to the World Trade Organization and others. But the fact is things didn't work out the way we thought they were going to work. And it wasn't because of bad intentions. It was just because, when things happen, the first battle plans are lost after the first shot, or as Mike Tyson said, everybody's got a plan until they get hit in the mouth, right? And so then we had September 11th. Then we had the Great Recession. One of the things that's often forgot about in the supply chain world, now I'm a trade and transportation lawyer, is that Fukushima started to change things. When we had the tsunami and the nuclear disaster in Japan, one of the things that companies started saying is, maybe just in time, we better have a little bit just in case. And then we had, of course, the beginning of the economic recovery, and then political change and what we're seeing, populism, not just in the United States, but around the world. So what does this all mean? Meanwhile, all of this is happening when our supply chain in our world is connected in global trade networks, unlike at any time we've ever seen. We had really, following the recession, during the recession, up until about 2008, China was growing, certainly, as an economy. Most US companies were going to China to sell into the Asian market and potentially sell back. But one of the important things was that during the recession didn't hit China in the same way as it did the United States. I lived in Columbus, taught at Case Western in Cleveland, and ran a trade association in Cleveland. And my law firm at the time was in Detroit during the recession, and I worked for the Canadian government in Detroit. So I was in Detroit and Cleveland during the recession. I mean, you're talking about ground zero for the recession. But meanwhile, China was growing and really decided at that point it was going to take over certain industries. And when China put the weight of a state-owned economy behind it, China started, again, in violation of many, many trade rules, taking over certain segments of the economy. And we really saw that accelerate over the last 10 years. The WTO, which was meant to force these rules, collapsed, essentially. We're really not doing anything in that multilateral. And so what that led was for the US and others to start saying, let's start looking to partners, one of which was in the Asia Pacific and the TPP, and then the TTIP and GCP, Team NEO. This may seem like ancient history to many of us. Everything seems like ancient history before March of 2020, right? But the COVID time warp. But we were spending a lot of time looking at how do we do regional trade deals, and GCP and Team NEO and others, we hosted a number of events where we would bring the Europeans on the TTIP deal. We would bring folks in from the Asia Pacific, because the Obama administration knew in order to sell those trade deals, they would need to be able to sell them in Ohio. Of course, what happened was the election of President Trump. And one of the things I don't want to, as soon as you say that word, folks have all kinds of different views. And frankly, you're either on one side or the other. There are very few people in the middle, unfortunately, on that. But what we can't ignore is that since 2016 forward, there have been a series of actions that have sought to rebalance this shift, that within companies prior to 2016, and frankly, up until about 2-3 years ago, the focus was get the product wherever you can in the world that meets basic quality standards, meets our quality at the lowest price possible, and we don't care where it's from, right? That was the message to every purchasing and procurement manager throughout Northeastern Ohio and elsewhere, was go find it, go get it. And then in turn, companies then were setting up operations. And there's no better example of that than Mexico. You know, Mexico went from basically being the maquiladoras in the 1990s to then competing against Team NEO and Jobs Ohio and pick your economic development organizations for some of the most state-of-the-art, largest manufacturing projects in the world. And Pro Mexico was out there, and many of you were likely competing against Pro Mexico, right? That economic development organization, they would meet with my clients and promise the world to them. And frankly, they would deliver at many times. You know, you need a road, you need 13 bridges built from that port to here, we'll do it for you. And they did. But that was all happening, and that was really the world in which we were living. And we saw more and more projects leaving, but not only new projects, but existing projects leaving our region and elsewhere. And so, meanwhile, there were significant costs associated with that. So we had this rebalancing happening. First, we put safeguards on washers and dryers, really to benefit Whirlpool in Northwestern Ohio. We put steel and aluminum tariffs on, and many of you know this, we put tariffs on roughly $300 billion worth of China-sourced goods, which continue to this day. We renegotiated the NAFTA, and we've been involved in deals with Korea, Japan, and Africa. And so all of these things were happening really in the blink of an eye. And the moment we went, that all of those things were just starting to sort themselves out, we had a pandemic. Now, one of the things that I think is lost in the discussion of what's happening right now as we move to where we are now is that these things are still in process, right? We're living in an inflationary environment, largely because of you know, when you stop the economy and restart it, how exactly does that work? We're also living in an inflationary environment because there's shocks to the system. There's shocks to the system in terms of Russia, Ukraine, and a number of other shocks around the world. So there's kind of a surface level of an inflationary environment that's going to impact Q3, Q4. And I can tell you right now, as somebody that's involved in a lot of deals, projects are getting pushed out. I know the pipeline's probably looking strong, but right now, every investor is going through their portfolios right now and saying, what is an absolute must-have? What can we park until we see how the dust settles? But underneath that is there is a series of inflationary triggers that are going to be with us no matter what happens when those clear out. And it's largely because of the things you see on this slide right here. We cannot put tariffs on $500 billion worth of $300 billion worth of China-sourced goods and not expect costs to go up. Companies have already adjusted. Some companies are continuing to source from China, pay the tariffs, split that with their supplier. Some companies have actually, and many in Northeastern Ohio actually, have said, you know what, we're not sourcing from China anymore for that particular component. We're not going to pay the duties. What we're going to do is we're going to source from Mexico or Vietnam or other places like that. So those companies are sitting there, but that usually comes at a higher price. So costs within the supply chain are already going up. And one of the things, we did a briefing for the White House in January about supply chain. And one of the things I shared with them is there was so much of a focus on what's happening in Long Beach, Los Angeles, at our ports, that if we clear out that congestion, that things will magically go back to normal. The problem is every one of our companies have been negotiating in contracts with the rail companies, with the ocean liners, with the freight forwarders, et cetera, and in particular warehousing space, and have been entering contracts at 3, 4, 5 years down the road because they just want to get some kind of certainty at any cost. So these costs in the transportation sector are with us now for 3, 4, 5 years. So there's going to be the top level, that bucket of inflationary triggers that are driven by some of the things that we see, these shocks in the system, but there's also inflationary triggers that are with us just systemically. And one of the things we have to be really honest about with consumers and with the public, et cetera, is that inflation isn't going away, right? It's just not. If you want to get off China, if you want to have more domestic manufacturing, that comes at a cost. And so, and I think there are some larger positives things that come from that. You raise wages and elsewhere. But we have to be very honest about that discussion, what's happening. And so I suggest when you look at all of the things that I just laid out. We're going to quickly move to some specific messages that you all can share. But there has never been a period of time in US history of which I'm aware where we've come out of the longest period of armed conflict we've ever been in has been the first 2 decades of the 21st century. We had an economic recession, we had a pandemic, and now we're fundamentally changing our economy. Now, if anybody thinks that the status quo or the old way is going to continue, they're out of their minds, right? There's no evidence to support that what we are about to enter, and we may be already in it, is the largest period of change in any of our lifetimes, even more than we saw in the 50s and 60s. That this period of time that we are in right now, we will see more political, policy, economic, and security change than we had at any time in our life. So what's that mean for us in Ohio? Well, really, it starts a bit with right here at home, which is the new NAFTA. Now, everybody's kind of forgot about this. What we did, and we're coming up on the 2-year anniversary of when the new NAFTA has been in force. So it's known as USMCA, CUSMA in Canada, and TMEC. But these are Ohio's 2 largest trading partners. Top of that list, Ohio's largest trading partner, bar none, is Canada. And so this fundamentally impacts our relationships for those of you that have in your portfolio not only attracting new investment or foreign direct investment, but also have the responsibility for expansion for our existing companies. You can't name a company in Northeastern Ohio that does not either A, have operations in Canada, or B, is in a supply chain that involves Canada. I've been doing it 25 years, I can't find one. Everybody's impacted, whether we're in the automotive sector, the aerospace sector, food manufacturing, et cetera. And we don't even think of it that way. And I'll come more to Canada, US in just a moment. But how did we get to NAFTA, redeveloping, rebranding, renovating the original NAFTA? I don't need to talk much about this to our team in Northeastern Ohio, right? We know that NAFTA became the punching bag, the piñata for everything that was wrong with trade, and rightly so. All of us can point to a company in our community that left the region and went to Mexico. You know, where I grew up, it was Delphi, it was Packard, then Delphi that went, you know. So there are a number of companies that we know the politics around that, and that went through. But what often gets lost in the discussion is that USMCA, which again is still kind of happening as underneath the surface. Nobody's really talking about it right now, but USMCA's #1 objective had nothing to do with Canada and Mexico. It was about China. The idea is if we were going to put tariffs on China, we could not then have a backdoor to China-sourced goods through Canada and Mexico. Now, Canada had always been a heck of a lot better on China than perhaps Mexico. Mexico's strategy over time, goods that were made in Mexico and getting into the North American supply chain were not really Mexican made anymore. They were actually China-sourced goods. In fact, oftentimes the Japanese who would set up auto suppliers and other types of advanced manufacturing facilities in Mexico, products of Japan going into Mexico, over time, those became China-sourced goods. Japan was putting its suppliers in China, and then those suppliers were exporting to Mexico. So the idea, when you really look at what USMCA is all about, it's to keep that China-sourced semi-finished goods and finished goods out of the North American supply chain. And there's no better example than that than in the auto sector. Under NAFTA, for an automobile made right in Northeastern Ohio, you know, that usually crosses the Canada-US border 6 to 11 times during the assembly process. That good would have to be 62.5% made. When you looked at the final vehicle, when you counted up all the parts, that would have to be 62.5% made in North America. When people actually took the car apart under NAFTA, it was about 42%. Why? Because goods that were being told that we were told were made in Mexico in particular were actually made in China or other markets outside of North America. So there was a strong push to say we need to get those standards. So we actually have to raise the threshold because we know in the actual threshold in the agreement, because we know in practice it'll be less. The second big issue in USMCA, as you all are out there thinking about how to pitch these things, is labor issues in Mexico. The reality was many of us lost projects to Mexico. I had many clients looking at the United States, Canada, and Mexico and said, we're going to Mexico, largely because of labor costs. We're willing to take the security risk and other issues that come with investing in Mexico because we think that there will be a cheaper cost. And what the prior administration and continues in this administration was, we're going to shut the back door to China. But while we're doing that, that doesn't mean we're going to want everybody to flood into Mexico, which actually is what happened in the short term. But over a period of time, we are going to raise labor rates in Mexico. And there's a few mechanisms in there. And this is the most active piece right now in Mexico, is there is something called the Rapid Response Labor Enforcement Mechanism, where right now, most Mexican US companies that have operation in Mexico have company unions. They're not real unions, right? But by 2023, under Mexico's domestic law, every company that has a company union has to go through and ask its workers if it wants to keep that company union or go get a new union, a more US looking or Canada looking union. That's happening between now and May of 2023. So that process is underway. And where there have been issues of, there's a great example, General Motors, for example, actually they went in the night before the election and the ballot boxes were already stuffed in one of General Motors' plants in Mexico. And so there have now been 4 cases brought under USMCA against companies in Mexico, all in the auto sector, by the way, where they have said, while you're going through this process between now and 2023, we think that you have violated labor rights. And during that, we're launching an investigation. And during that time, your goods are not able to have NAFTA treatment or USMCA treatment. And so this is a big deal. And if you think about those of you that are competing for projects, right now, that labor calculus is going to be a little bit different in Mexico because of what was already happening in Mexico going into 2023, but it is now being enforced. And the Biden administration is flexing a lot of muscle on that. We are hearing that there's at least 6 more labor enforcement cases coming in the automotive sector, aerospace, and one other in the next 2 or 3 months. And a lot of that's timed with the midterms to show that the US is tough on labor. And then there's the third piece, which is maybe I'm watching too much of The Offer on Paramount Plus, the making of The Godfather. But there's also the third piece of USMCA NAFTA, which is called the Michael Corleone strategy, which is while the US had Canada and Mexico at the table, they settled all the family's business. And so it was, and again, I'm from the Mahoning Valley, so I say this with love to my Italian-American friends, because that was everybody I knew growing up in Warren. But issues with dairy with Canada, we've been fighting over that forever and a day. Canadians can't watch when Canadians watch the Super Bowl, they don't get Super Bowl commercials. They have to watch Canadian content. So the NFL had an issue with that. There were a series of issues that, while we had everybody at the table, are changed by USMCA. And some of those are really important to our companies. So just winding up USMCA, because I think it's a significant issue when we're pitching economic development projects, because the labor calculus will not be the same in Mexico as it was prior to now. And are we actually seeing labor rates skyrocket? Not yet. But between now and May of 2023, there's a lot happening in terms of unionization that will tend to equalize that. And so there was a lot of discussion when we said we were going to rip up the NAFTA. Well, we didn't rip it up. Some folks said it's a rebrand. About 60% of USMCA is the same as the original NAFTA. But we did 3 things. First, we put a fresh coat of paint on. The agreement was very old. And some of the areas that really were improved are critical to us in Northeastern Ohio. Moving polymers, chemicals, coating, bringing raw materials from within North America. So you start thinking about trying to attract electric vehicle companies or semiconductor companies, solar companies. Let's face it, solar companies are just big semiconductors. That's what they are. I represent one of the 2 US manufacturers, and they're in Toledo. It's just a big semiconductor is what a solar panel is with some glass on it, right? But if you need those raw materials, you're either importing the lithium, nickel, cobalt from China, or you're importing it from Canada. Which one do you want to import it from? And we've made it easier in USMCA to do those types of things. There is what I've called putting in this idea of a renovation. Not only are we putting on fresh coat of paints, we're putting in new fixtures and appliances. So we have a digital chapter. We're doing some things on the border. Most of this is very prospective and forward looking. So it's still way too early to tell how that's going to work out. But I do think the digital chapter creates the most, within North America, the most liberal standard and protections for digital companies, as well as prohibits Mexico and Canada from doing, you have to invest, you have to put your servers in our region if you want to actually engage in digital trade in our country. So we saw some of that in various jurisdictions in Mexico, that you would have to, if you want to put your company here, you have to put your data center here too, which is important for us because Ohio, we've been very successful in attracting data centers. Why? Because we have a technology, workforce, all of those wonderful things. But the real answer is we don't have earthquakes and hurricanes, right? That's why we're attracting a lot of the data centers as well. So that digital chapter should be helpful for us. One, it prohibits Canada and Mexico and now Japan, and this is part of now all US trade deals, from allowing those countries around the world and provinces and states to require those servers to be there. But it also allows for some of these future things on competitiveness. And then lastly, and most importantly, is we're tearing down walls and putting in new structures, particularly in the automotive sector. So when I mentioned earlier that under the auto rules of origin and under NAFTA, it was 62.5%. Now, passenger vehicles and light trucks have to be 75% made in North America. And every one of the parts, companies have to go through every single one of the parts and say, is it a core part, which means 75% made in North America? Is it a principal part? 70% made in North America. Complementary part, which are basically everything else, 65% made in North America. So we raised all those thresholds. Additionally, when all of the original equipment manufacturers, so GM, Ford, Honda, you pick them, Navistar, any of those companies, when they're done and they're looking at their vehicle, not only does it have to be 75% made in North America, it has 70% of the steel has to be from North America. Great news for some of our steel manufacturers. And in 2027, that steel will have to be melted and poured in North America. So not only can you import slab and ingot from around the world and then do the finished steel, the fabrication, steel centers, et cetera, in North America, you actually have to make the steel in North America, melt, bring the scrap, the pig iron. So that's good news for places like the Port of Cleveland and elsewhere that will bring in more scrap pig iron in places like Cliffs, for example. That's why we're seeing the expansion of Cliffs and others. So all of this is happening really over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years. These are dramatic changes that, quite frankly, are not being accounted for in a lot of the discussions out there, because USMCA came into force. The last thing the Canadian Parliament did in March of 2020 was pass USMCA. The US and Mexico had done it a few weeks before while they were heading out the door for COVID. Like COVID, USMCA kind of got lost in the COVID discussion, but it's there. And then I talked about the rapid response labor enforcement mechanism. That's the Mexico labor issue. One final point on the autos is that in the auto industry, not only does it have to be 75% made in North America, 70% of the steel, 45% of the labor has to be made with wages paid $16 an hour or higher. Now, this often is mischaracterized as you have to pay people $16 an hour in Mexico. That's not what that means. What that means is when folks are sitting there at the Renaissance Center at General Motors and looking at their new production lines, they say, look, I got to have 45% of this new product, my new electric vehicle, hybrid, whatever they're building. 16%, 45% of that needs to be made with $16 an hour or higher. That ain't happening in Mexico yet. So I have to source from my suppliers, from the suppliers in the US and Canada. So that's what that was designed to do, was to stop that southward migration of all of the tool and die people, the metal benders, the extruders. A lot of those folks are in our backyard. Those are the folks we grew up with in our communities in Northeastern Ohio. That some of that supply was going to start gradually, if not rapidly, moving down into Mexico. There's a park on that because those folks are paying $16 an hour or higher. One interesting development, because I've been saying now for a couple of years, you won't see wages go to $16 or higher in Mexico. The Japanese automakers in Mexico don't have US suppliers outside of Honda. So a lot of the Japanese suppliers that are making in Mexico, they didn't have the option to go find US and Canadian suppliers. So they actually have raised the rates for some of their suppliers in Mexico, which again feeds back into that cycle that I talked about, is that starts to level out that competitiveness. So I know USMCA is likely not something all of you are thinking about on your checklists of things that you're pitching, but right now, you can't make, under the rules in USMCA, you cannot make an electric vehicle battery and import the cell. It will not count for USMCA. There's no way to do it. Trust me, I've tried. What you have to do is you have to make the cell in the United States. That's why we're seeing the automotive announcements that we've seen our friends out in Avon, our friends in Windsor, Detroit. We're seeing these announcements because the auto industry knows, and other advanced manufacturing knows, that it needs to be in the United States because it won't comply with USMCA. It won't be able to meet this. And so this is a huge selling point for those of us in Ohio. And so the automotive rules, if I was looking at how to pitch this, automotive rules of origin, this is why my clients are investing in Ohio and that state up north, unfortunately, and Canada as well. And they're also investing here because of the Canada connection that I'll come back to. This extends to most of our suppliers in advanced manufacturing and mobility and aerospace. I have to tell you, one of the great success stories of USMCA is the work that was done for polymers, chemicals, and coatings companies. It used to be a pain in the neck to move those products in North America. And that touched virtually everything. And compared to the rest of the world, was way more competitive in terms of how their trade deals work. We have now the best in class. We're right now, it used to be in the old days, you would have to trace every molecule to say that that was made in North America. Now, if you're doing the mixing, the processing, if you're gonna do that out in Akron or Kent or somewhere like that, boom, that counts as North American made. So that has been a significant, and I can tell you, I have a number of clients, particularly from the EU, looking at, hey, we might as well invest in the United States, then we can call it made in North America. And I talked about the digital chapter. I'm very bullish on food manufacturing. We are seeing a lot of activity in that space. I think there's probably no area right now that is saying we cannot be spread overseas. We need to be right in our backyard. USMCA has done a lot to make food manufacturing move freely. And that's particularly true between Canada and Mexico, Canada, the US. And of course, we import significant amounts of seasonal produce from Mexico as well. So very quickly, and I'll just wrap up here in the next 7 minutes or so, but USMCA isn't it, right? One of the points I wanted to emphasize, I would be out there pitching that nonstop. I would actually have a one-pager that I would put to people to say, here's how USMCA works and here's how you need to invest in our region, because it touches everything. And that was by design. That's why we negotiated it the way that we did. Now, I talked at the outset and I got a bit ahead of myself, but looking ahead to the third and fourth quarters, there's a circular part to what's happening in the supply chain. The lowly container that leaves the Port of Cleveland, doing our goes through Montreal and out through the Seaway. And oftentimes now with our European connections that the Port of Cleveland has. But so much is also moving from Savannah, Wilmington, Long Beach, Los Angeles, and then it just kind of cycles, right? What we saw is when there's a disruption in that cycle, that creates congestion. And transportation costs are all over the maps right now. Thompson, Hine, right in your backyard, I'm saying this not as a pitch, but our transportation team, I'm a part of it, but the folks here in the DC office are the leaders in what is happening on the Ocean Shipping Reform Act. It was our team that has that legislation that President Biden just signed. We led that with Nitley and others. So if any of you, these are just some of the things that are happening out here and changes in the transportation system on both ocean shipping and rail And, you know, again, our firm is leading the charge on this. So if you all want more information about this, but I flagged this because there's a lot of activity here. But the key takeaway is this is going to take time to clear out. But even when we clear out the congestion and the circular nature of the system, there's still the cyclical nature, which is there is no environment more than transportation that's more supply and demand related. It is the best evidence of a true market economy that you have. And what we are seeing is costs are off the roof. Trucking is starting to come down, is starting to normalize a bit. But what we are seeing are warehousing costs, again, are locked in for 3 to 5 years. You know, most of the last 18 months of my life have been trying to find warehouses all over the United States. Because people are, when they can get the inventory here, they don't care about just in time. They're getting it here, they're storing it here. And companies are sitting on massive inventories in warehousing. And a lot of that is in Ohio and throughout the Midwest because of our central location. And so these costs are with us. So there's going to be, there's also a lot more increase. You can see 50% increase in air cargo utilization. And which of course air cargo is about as expensive as you can get in terms of shipping. So these shipping costs are with us for a while now. In my view, that isn't great for the economy. That's certainly not great for my companies that have to rely on these. But there is an economic development piece to this, which is companies are looking for opportunities to be centrally located. And of course, our geography is just critical to that in Ohio. You know, certainly where I live in central Ohio is key, but so is northeastern Ohio. When you and I know many of you are out there pitching it, but one of the things that I just emphasize to you is I think some folks have been dismissive of this pitch and saying, transportation, that'll clear out. Because we'll see the ports clear out probably, God forbid, there's another COVID shock, probably early 2023, but maybe by Q2, we'll start seeing some normalization. Shanghai, the closures in Shanghai kind of threw things off for a while, but these costs are with us now 3 to 5 years, at least. So there's an opportunity to go out there and continue to pitch Ohio's geography because this is with us. This is part of the cyclical nature, not the circular nature of the system. This summer, just again, as we wind down here, one of the things to really keep an eye on over the next 3 months or so is what are we going to do on China? So we had, if you just take, I kind of gave the history lesson at the beginning, USMCA, the supply chain COVID cyclical cycle, China's the other big C to keep an eye on as we're looking at these things. Right now, we have tariffs on a lot of Chinese sourced goods. There is significant pressure on the administration right now to lift those tariffs. In my view, that's a terrible idea if you're not getting anything in return from China. But we need to maybe work smarter. There's a process underway right now where all of the China tariffs are under review. And that has nothing to do with politics. That is, they're allowed to be on for 4 years. After 4 years, there's an automatic review. What we expect to see at some point in the fall is that we'll start seeing adjustments on the list. Is that the Biden administration is going to go through the list and I think make the argument that we're working smarter, not harder than the Trump administration did. The Trump administration had a shotgun approach. Basically, if it's coming from China, other than consumer goods that would ruin the holidays, basically I say the only thing that are not on the list of China tariffs are my Saturday morning. Things you buy from Costco, Walmart, Target, or Home Depot, right? The rest of that stuff is all on the tariff list. And it's causing costs to our companies. What the administration is likely to do and go through and see what are the products on those lists that we don't really want China to have in areas like ICT, in electric vehicle production, in sensitive technologies, and the rest will likely, in my opinion, be lifted. So one of the things to kind of keep an eye on is how does that impact companies? But one of the things I'm concerned about are what about those companies in Ohio that had products that were subject to tariffs and then changed their supply chain, and now those tariffs are going to be lifted. So they've already said we're willing to go to Mexico, go to Vietnam. I mean, we may even have invested in Ohio or Canada or elsewhere, and we're willing to pay more prices. All of a sudden, those tariffs are going to be lifted. So this is going to be very, very noisy this fall. And that's a policy debate, it's a political debate, but it's going to have implications because I think some of the companies, and I can tell you for a fact, some of the companies that I work with have been kind of sitting to wait to see how this goes before they make a decision. Are we going to make that investment in Ohio? Are we going to make that investment in North America? Or are we going to keep doing it the way that we're doing with China? We've been grinning and bearing it since 2018. And we could probably pay those costs for another few years if we think they're going to be lifted. But the minute those tariffs are either not lifted or lifted, decisions are going to be made. And one of the big issues just finally on China is forced labor. We do a lot of work in this area. There was legislation that has now come into force that products coming in from Beijing and other places of China are now subject to great scrutiny. We just put out a major client alert on what companies need to do, but stuff coming in from China and other parts of the world are going to really be looked at not only for tariffs, but for forced labor. This is a huge issue for solar panels, semiconductors, and critical minerals, because they're all coming from that part of the world. Most of the solar panels that we use in the United States that are assembled in the United States and then installed are from the part of China that's subject to forced labor scrutiny. Now, that's great news for the two manufacturers of US solar panels, both of whom are in Ohio, Toledo Solar and First Solar. So there's actually an opportunity to really look at who are those companies that are part of the solar supply chain that are going to know that they can no longer be part of the China supply chain and potentially need to be investing in places like Ohio to be toward the tier ones. A lot of activity, which happen to be the same companies that are involved in semiconductors. I just want to end in saying that competitiveness is the key for this. One of the messages, and I'm not here to tell you how to pitch Ohio beyond these specific trade issues. You all have done a fantastic job on how to pitch your region, the Ohio miracle. I'm proud to live there. I'm out there talking about Ohio all the time. But there's a lot of great things that we have. But I just want to say, let's not forget about Canada. This is a map from 1787. There's no border between Canada and the United States and Ohio. Where most of us are sitting, I'm in DC today, but where most of us sit in Ohio was once part of the province of Quebec. We've been trading fur and beaver pelts and everything else across those borders for hundreds of years. The danger is when the lawyers arrive. You can see this is where we get into weird regulations. I took this picture many moons ago. My son's 11 now, but this is a playground equipment that was approved for 2 to 5 year olds in the US and 1.5 to 5 year olds in Canada. I don't know what the difference would be. Maybe the Canadian kids are smarter. I don't know. But in my opinion, they would all lick it, get splinters, those kind of things. But we have these regulatory differences. What is the message between Canada and Ohio? What are some of the things? If you look at the 3 largest land border crossings in North America, the busiest border crossings, it's Laredo, Nuevo Laredo, Detroit, Windsor, and Buffalo, Niagara. Think about where we sit in northeastern Ohio. Most of you can walk out your door, turn left and drive for 3 hours in a dog leg and you're either in Detroit, or turn right in a little dog leg and you're in Buffalo, Niagara. We are sitting in one of the most active trade corridors in the world. And it's the trade corridors for existing industries, automotive, aerospace, chemical, polymer, food manufacturing. But it's also the heart right now of electric vehicles, hydrogen production, semiconductors. I would be out there right now pitching this component, because if I'm a company, particularly overseas right now, I know that I'm going to need to get critical minerals from Canada. I know I may need to have some of my workforce in Canada, which quite frankly has a much better immigration system for high tech than we do. But I can be in Ohio and have that proximity and geographic proximity to Canada, where there's already these established industries. This should be the pitch, because I can tell you right now, that's what my clients that are in Europe and Asia and elsewhere are looking for. Where can we be in one spot and have that coverage for the US, Canada, and North America? How do you do this? Absolute final point. There's already a lot of activity happening. Case Western Reserve. I got into the Canada-US world 25 years ago because of Case Western Reserve Law School has a very active Canada-US program, annual conference. The Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, and now USMCA, parts of that were drafted in the basement of Case Western Reserve School of Law. There's a history there of companies convening every spring, strong networks, OAI, Ohio Aerospace Institute, NASA Glenn, and many of you have a number of Canadian companies in your region right now. And you may not know they're Canadian because very few fly the Canadian flag out there. They kind of walk undetected among us. So there are already these companies here. We are planning visits of Northeastern Ohio mayors in the fall up to Ontario and to meet with existing companies that have invested in the region, but potential companies as well. I think if I was you and wanted to really focus on this area, I'd be talking to folks like the Bank of Montreal, who has extensive operations now in Cleveland. CIBC does Canadian Bank as well. And the Ohio PNC Bank, sorry, I left my great friends, Dave Olson, who I'm on the board with, of AmCham Canada, who's here in DC with us. So PNC is one of the only US banks that has full service operations in Canada. And the Ohio Business Roundtable is looking to bring a series of Canadian CEOs down for meetings, but also to look at potential investment opportunities here. And Ontario is visiting Ohio at a government to government level. And I would just say one of the mistakes that I note when you guys are doing your, I mean, guys in our Cleveland Midwest sense, gender neutral, it's like y'all, right? But one of the things that I've noticed over the years that we have not done a great job of in our state. Jobs Ohio has done a fantastic job in recruiting from Canada, as has Team Neo. Mindy and the gang have done a fantastic job, One Columbus, et cetera, et cetera. But we spend a lot of time in Toronto and Montreal. And I think there are a lot more connections and many other connections to look at in Kitchener-Waterloo, which is Canada's tech region, and in other parts of Quebec, particularly in advanced energy, Saskatchewan, which is one of the critical mineral hubs, Calgary, energy hub. So it's not just focused on just Toronto and Montreal, which are the easiest to get to from Ohio, but that's it. I'll just end there. That's a lot to throw at you over 45 minutes or so that we've been talking. But we have at Thompson Hine, this isn't again a pitch. I'm not here to pitch you guys on the firm. You all, most of you probably know Thompson Hine already, but we have a free service. It's called Smart Trade that we put things out almost every day on what's happening in this environment. And because this is going to be a very busy fall, I would suggest you log on to this and then you can get the updates, which should help you shape your pitches as you're out there recruiting companies. And final, I keep saying final, but one thing I would just say from the depths of my heart, we all love new projects. We love greenfield. We love cutting ribbons, and so do your decision makers. But don't forget about the companies that are already in your markets. I've moved so many companies to Ohio, working with a number of you and Team Neo and GCP and so many others, but sometimes they get forgotten in the shuffle, right? Because they're already here. And so I know expansion, retention, those types of things, that's where I actually think we're going to see a significant amount of activity, because inflation's going to park some projects for now. But it's also going to mean a lot of companies are saying there's opportunities for us. How do we expand in the market we already are? And Northeastern Ohio is doing a fantastic job. Jobs Ohio, the state is doing a fantastic job. Look, we're the golden children down here at Select USA and IEDC and all these things we go to. But let's not forget about the companies we already have, because they need some love too, particularly on the workforce side right now. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Olivia, and thank you for your time. And I'm always here. You can call me and find me anytime you need. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dan. So we probably have time for a couple questions. I just wanted to throw one out there to start. And if you have any additional questions, please put them in the chat or the Q&A feature. But Dan, you mentioned a couple different industries that companies are going to need to start thinking seriously about shifting to North American manufacturing, like supply chains. So I'm wondering, and you also touched on in the beginning of your discussion around the USMCA, like China strategy specifically. I'm wondering if you can just briefly talk about how the China strategy and the requirements that went along with that impacted some of the supply chain issues that we saw during the pandemic. And I'm also wondering if we are continuing to shift supply chain to North America, especially in light of some of the shortages and issues we saw during the pandemic, beyond investing in things like manufacturing in chips. Like, what are the other industries that we should be shoring up in our region?
That's a great question. I think, number one, the lesson of the pandemic was, well, I think for a long time when we would sit in trade fora in our little nerd world of trades in the think tanks, people would say, you know why people in Northeastern Ohio don't support trade is because they don't understand it. They don't get it. And all we have to do is show them how global supply chains work, and one day they'll get it. Well, I think people saw how global supply chains work during the pandemic, and it scared the hell out of them. Like, nobody expected to ever have a time in a day where I can walk through my house and say, man, the light bulb's out there. And you click on I don't even need to go to Lowe's or Home Depot anymore. I click on my phone and it's there. Some days those light bulbs will be there the same day when I go on Amazon or pick your service. Nobody expected to ever go to the grocery store and not find toilet paper, right? In our lifetime, right? And those types of things. So people saw how supply chains work and it scared the hell out of them. And I think what we're seeing in the wake of that is, but we have to be careful about not overdoing it, right? We will never be able to make things 100% made in the USA. It's just, that's not the way businesses work. So we have to find a middle ground right now. I'm a big believer in the concept of ally shoring. Treasury Secretary Yellen and Deputy Prime Minister Freeland in Canada met and called it friend shoring. This idea that supply chains are going to be not China focused, not Asia Pacific focused, but again, going back to the point I said earlier, do you want your critical minerals from China or do you want them from Canada when you're building your supply chain? And not only geographic proximity, but stability and elsewhere. And so I think there's going to be a whole series. Of course, we saw the Intel investment and everything that's coming, the mega projects that are coming in its wake, not all related to Intel, but Ohio is going to benefit greatly to that. I truly believe ally shoring is not a buzzword. I think it's a very real fact for companies that are saying, okay, we still need to get our raw materials from certain parts of the world. That frankly, just because we can't get them anywhere else. One thing is nitrile gloves. You can only get that rubber from Malaysia and other parts of Asia, so like there's nothing you can do about that. That's just nature and geology and all those kind of things. So, but where can we do that production? I actually think that what we're going to see is a strong push. The areas that I think electric vehicles, semiconductors, I think sensitive technologies will be all US, Canada focused, and probably Japan and parts of the European Union. In that, I don't think you're going to see a lot of that in Mexico, and you'll see some aerospace in Mexico because it's already there. Food manufacturing is something that I think you'll see a US, Canada focus, maybe some with Mexico, just because I think people want that to be closer and those supply chains. But in the long run, I actually think Mexico will still continue to be, along with Canada, where a lot of the activity is happening. That's why there's such a focus on raising the labor rates there. But the reality is, Olivia, one thing that, you're on the GR side is our politicians aren't sharing, is the point I made at the outset, is people are going to have to pay more. That's the bottom line. And so I think until we see, and this is something I know GCP talks a lot about with its members, have the priorities for procurement changed. Are we seeing at the procurement and purchasing level, it's not just about low cost anymore, quality and cost, it's also about proximity and supply chains. And I think we're all going through that exercise right now. And that's going to shake out. And that's why these decisions, right now, it's a close call in a lot of companies. Like, look, we still need low cost or we're not going to be able to compete. But if the China tariffs move this way or that way, that may change, may change the calculus, right? And so that's why the next, I said probably the next Q3, Q4, very important time for our economy coming forward.
Thank you. That's really helpful. One question that popped up in the chat, a quick one. Patrick asks, where can we find more information on the mayoral visits?
Yeah, sure. Excuse me. Those are in process right now. The Canadian Consulate in Detroit, I'm working on it as well, along with MAP and the Northeastern Ohio Association of Mayors are working on an agenda for that, and we're happy. I don't want to get ahead of those organizations. I don't know what the rules are on how they do things, but as that develops, happy to share. I think we're looking at fall of 2022, but that's a great opportunity. But I also want to be clear. I think one of the points that I didn't hammer this home enough is one of the things about Canada-US is to regular contact. Regular contact with the Canadian companies in your region already. And if you don't know who those are, I'm happy to tell you. We know who those companies are in a lot of your markets. And Canadian companies that are looking to invest, Brendan Murray from Jobs Ohio, I got to say, that guy just started showing up in Canada. And I would bump into him at the most random Canada-US events in Canada, or even like not Canada-US, but Mississauga Chamber. It's like, why is Jobs Ohio here? And they were pulling so many projects out of there, including some of my clients. So, that it's just that regular contact and being there. And I say this with love for our Canadian brothers and sisters is if a community kind of shows them that they care about Canada, they tend to come, right? Because they tend to feel that the US isn't always focused on them. And so they'll come to the market. It's just, you have to be there on visits or regular contact and sister cities and those kind of things that may seem fluffy, but they are very important in terms of the psychology is, hey, that's a market in that region that understands the importance of Canada-US. Because it is. We as Ohioans, look, and I'm mindful of the time here, I knew nothing about Canada growing up in Northeastern Ohio, other than, and some of you have heard me tell this story, like our first family vacation was to Niagara Falls, and I don't remember anything about Niagara Falls, the falls. I just remember we stayed in a hotel that had a vibrating bed. And so I asked my dad like 5 years ago, what kind of cheap hotel did you have us staying in? Put a quarter in the like that's all I knew about Canada. Did I know that every company in Northeastern Ohio is tied in some way to Canada? No, it wasn't until I was at Case and got that exposure. And I think that's part of the education we have to do, because we take it for granted in Ohio. We don't think of ourselves as a border state, and we are. You just go out in the middle of the lake, you're sitting in Canada, right? And so that's something I think that is a key pitch, particularly for those overseas companies that are looking to invest, because a lot of those companies are making the choice right now. Do I invest in Canada or do I invest in the United States? And if you can give them the option to be in both, and I'm putting my money where our mouth is. I'm part of a group that we're putting $3 billion in a binational innovation district that's doing exactly that in a market in the Midwest that's trying to span the Canada-US border. And because I believe in that concept, that's what we're seeing companies making that call. And if you and your community can make yourself seem as, hey, you can be in both places at once, that's a huge pitch to some of our clients and customers.
Thanks so much, Dan. Really appreciate your time and this really, really wonderful discussion. So before we close, and we're wrapping up right now, but if anyone has any quick announcements that they want to throw into the chat for the good of the group, please do so. Just a reminder to folks that we are going to take a summer holiday in July, so we will not have a node meeting then, but we're really excited to reconnecting in August, and you can watch out for those details. As a member of the program committee, I can tell you that we are planning a lot of great upcoming sessions, and we always welcome your input. So thank you so much to everyone for joining us this morning. Special thank you to Dan Ujczo for being here and having this great discussion with us, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Thanks so much.